Sri Lanka over almost 40 years now. It's my second home. But before you start looking at the property tax records, I don't actually own any property in Colombo, so there's no tax evasion question here. It's my second home in the sense that I had very good friends here with whom I stay very regularly. But for the purposes of what I'm going to say now, I'm going to abuse my title as CEO of the International Centre for Tax and Development, and I'm going to sort of skip around the world, and sometimes I'm going to wear a Sri Lanka hat, and sometimes an Africa hat, and other kinds of hats. But I'm going to start wearing an Africa hat. I'm going to be a sort of cheerleader, if you want, for an organisation we'll hear a little bit more about later, which is the African Tax Administration Forum. And I want to tell you how seriously I take the African Tax Administration Forum, which is I don't just wear their badge here, but I carry their pen regularly, and my notepaper that I have here is actually African Tax Administration Forum notepaper. Aidan Keenley, who's over here, Aidan, you raise a hand so that people know who you are. Aidan will talk later about the African Tax Administration Forum, ATAF, and he's very happy to give you one of these badges if you'd like to wear one. Now, ATAF is about 3 years old, and it has been created with a great deal of enthusiasm. It's a very active organization. Alan Kadina was one of the really key founder members of the African Tax Administration Forum. And what I want to talk about is why there is so much enthusiasm behind the African Tax Administration Forum at present, and why taxation is now beginning to be taken so very seriously as an important and interesting subject in Africa. There are a number of reasons, but just let me run through a small number, some of which have been mentioned earlier. One is that in Africa, as in Sri Lanka, we know that the era of development aid from the West is coming to an end. Governments are no longer going to get large amounts of money from Western aid donors, and that's not actually a bad thing, in my opinion. Apart from anything else, aid is the most unstable source of government revenue, as Professor Lakshman said earlier, and it's not easy to run a government with a very unstable source of revenue. So governments know they have to raise their aid. Another issue that Alan mentioned briefly, there is an enormous amount of exploration and development of minerals in particular in Africa at present, as indeed there may be in Sri Lanka. And the awareness that mining companies in particular are often paying trivial amounts of money to the public exchequer in return for a massive exploitation of minerals is something that really irritates people, and irritates them in a very productive way. On, if you like, the more positive side, South Africa, and Aidan is going to talk about South Africa this afternoon, so I'm just going to say that since the end of apartheid and the introduction of majority rule, the South African Revenue Service has been a great success in raising revenue. And they have raised revenue, well, through many specific techniques, but partly by communicating very credibly with the South African public that there are an awful lot of debts, social debts of apartheid to be paid, and the taxpayers are going to have to pay for that, and there is no alternative. And that has been quite inspirational for other countries in Africa. A fourth factor that's been important in many countries in Africa, the revenue services have been unified, there are semi-autonomous revenue authorities, quite impressive organizations run by very impressive people, and I have to say, she blushes every time I say this, but Alan Kagina is one of a number of very impressive people running revenue authorities in Africa. And overall, as Alan said earlier, there is a sense in Africa and behind ATAF that taxation is not just taxation, it's something to do with state building. And I want to come back a little bit later and say a little bit more about what that might mean. But let me just shift now from Africa to the OECD countries, because that enthusiasm about tax in Africa is now similarly true in the last 2 years in all the OECD countries. And the reason for that is very simple and very clear. All the OECD governments now have massive fiscal problems because of a combination of having bailed out a lot of banks and because of economic recession and loss of revenue. They're facing massive fiscal deficits, and suddenly they're beginning to look for revenue very seriously. And this is having some very positive effects and is very important for developing countries. Because until recently, the international tax evasion that we know is practiced on a massive scale worldwide was frankly not of much interest to many OECD governments, and least of all to my own government in Britain. It was of more interest to governments of France and Germany. But there's been a real shift in the last couple of years. And the idea of more international cooperation to reduce international tax evasion has really taken off in a very big way. And it's interesting, if you read journals like The Economist magazine from London, the Financial Times from London, that you traditionally think somehow represent the voice of business and profit. I mean, they are carrying endless stories about the need for more revenue. I mean, the debate has changed very considerably. And a very important part of that story in Africa and in the OECD countries is that there are quite a lot of civil society organizations campaigning very actively about issues of tax and tax evasion, and particularly importantly for Africa, international tax evasion. We have here Atiya Waris. Atiya, would you like to just identify yourself? Who is a lawyer from the University of Nairobi, but also represents the Tax Justice Network, which has been the premier among these campaigning organizations. Now, they campaign over many issues, but there are really three that are important. You can't shut down tax havens, but at least trying to control and limit tax havens internationally. Secondly, trying to improve the reporting by transnational corporations of where they're generating their profits. And thirdly, trying to induce more automaticity in the exchange of information across tax administrations internationally about the activities of companies that are located in more than one country. These are all very big issues, but they're all very much on the agenda now. And I mean, speaking from the UK, the amount of the programs we hear on the BBC radio, on the media about taxation, it's changed almost beyond recognition in the last 2 or 3 years. Let me just skip briefly to the United States, where something very interesting is happening. As you probably know, the dominant ideas of most American governments in recent years have been very anti-tax. I mean, tax is thought to be a bad thing. But some of you may have noticed it's very interesting, and this was started by Warren Buffett, the big international investor. Warren Buffett started writing and talking and saying, why am I, Warren Buffett, not paying more tax? He said, why do I pay a lower proportion of my total income, and his income measures, well, many millions, I don't know if it comes into billions per year, but it's a lot of money. He said, why am I paying a lower proportion of my income in tax than my office assistant? And partly as a result of his initiative, there now is an organization in the United States of very wealthy people that are actually saying, please tax us. And they're saying, it's not that they want to pay tax for its own sake, but they're saying they are genuinely concerned about the implications of the growing financialization of the world economy and the fact that people like them who are making massive profits from financialization are not paying taxes. Because the implication for public revenues, for public expenditure on some basic issues, and the implications also for social stability, the sense of fairness and inequality are, it's struck home. And you've seen all the demonstrations now against globalization and capitalism, etc., which is going on. And these are, in the OECD countries, we take these very seriously now. I mean, there is a lot of resentment against wealthy people who don't pay tax. So there is this great enthusiasm or interest and indeed conflict in much of the world around taxation. And let me just shift back now to the African Tax Administration Forum. As Alan Kagina said, when this was founded, the idea of tax as state building was a sort of key theme. That's the key idea. Tax is not just about tax, it's about state building. Now, that could mean quite a few different things, and what I want to do is just run through some of the possible meanings and implications of the idea of tax as state building. The first point, which is obvious, and it's been said several times today, but it's worth saying again, of relevance to Sri Lanka, is just the total amount of revenue. As far as I know, Sri Lanka is probably, this might be a world historical record of a country that during a long period of conflict, when you would expect governments to be raising more revenue because they were fighting a war, during a period of economic growth, when you would expect the ratio of tax to GDP to go up, it went down. And that's been going on for at least 20 years, and as people said earlier, this is not any one government, it's all governments of Sri Lanka. Now, there are many implications of this, but I just want to mention two. I'm not going to give you any statistics on this, but if you actually look at the fiscal figures for Sri Lanka over the last 20 years, and in actually 30, 40 years, you see that the proportion of total government spending that goes on salaries has increased and increased and increased, which means that 30 years ago, the average public servant actually had other money to spend to do things with. You know, whether it's offices or equipment or vehicles or whatever it is that public servants need to do their job. The amount of money that the average public servant in Sri Lanka has to do anything once the salaries are paid has gone down and down till it's very small. This government is employing a lot of people, but it's giving them very few tools to do anything. And that should be a very serious concern. More concretely, Sri Lanka is a country that, let's remember, at independence was one of the leading countries in Asia in terms of human development and health and education. If you look at the figures today, just look at the figures on expenditure, government expenditure in education in the Asian region. They are shocking. The Sri Lankan figures are shocking. Sri Lanka is virtually the lowest spender in public education in most Asian regions. It's lower than Bangladesh, it's lower than Nepal. And the implications of that for the quality of the labour force, and anyone from the private sector here, and other people know what I'm talking about, the quality of the labour force, and therefore economic growth, are very serious. So there is a major issue there. There is another issue, potentially, that I'm just going to run through these. You know, what would Warren Buffett say if he came to look at Sri Lanka? Are those issues of inequality? Evidently some people doing well, some people not doing so well. The potential implications for social stability, are they relevant here or not? I'll let you answer that question. Thirdly, security, and this was mentioned earlier. There is a nexus of activities between terrorism, crime, drug smuggling, money laundering internationally. It's complicated, all countries have to deal with it. The tax agencies cannot deal with it by themselves, but they are a very important part of the solution of this, because if you don't have the information that tax authorities to collect, it's very hard to solve those problems. So there is a security dimension of state building. And finally, and most obviously, but worth saying, there is simply the economic growth dimension. And Dr. Kaligama, I think, covered that well. I don't need to repeat. But a taxation system that is just really complicated to deal with is not conducive to investment and growth. So I'm going to conclude now, just to say, and again, let me say, I'm really talking to the people from the Inland Revenue Department in particular. I think the phrase that Alan Kagina used earlier, from tax collectors to state builders, is not a bad way of thinking about your job in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mick. Very good. Disturb your flow of thinking.